Human rights abuses. Main article: Human rights abuses in Jammu and Kashmir. After insurgency started in the Kashmir Valley because of above reasons in the late 1980s, Indian troops entered in the Kashmir Valley to control the insurgency. Some analysts have suggested that the number of Indian troops in Jammu and Kashmir is close to 600,000, although estimates vary and the Indian government refuses to release official figures. The troops have been accused and held accountable for several humanitarian abuses and have engaged in mass extrajudicial killings, torture, rape and sexual abuse. Indian security forces have been implicated in many reports for enforced disappearances of thousands of Kashmiris, whereas the security forces deny having their information and/or custody. This is often in association with torture or extrajudicial killing. Human rights activists estimate the number of disappeared to be over 8,000, last seen in government detention. The disappeared are believed to be dumped in thousands of mass graves across Kashmir. A State Human Rights Commission inquiry in 2011 has confirmed there are thousands of bullet-ridden bodies buried in unmarked graves in Jammu and Kashmir. Of the 2,730 bodies uncovered in 4 of the 14 districts, 574 bodies were identified as missing locals, in contrast to the Indian government's insistence that all the graves belonged to foreign militants. Military forces in Jammu and Kashmir operate under impunity and emergency powers granted to them by the central government. These powers allow the military to curtail civil liberties, creating further support for the insurgency. The insurgents have also abused human rights, driving Kashmiri pundits away from the Kashmir Valley, an action regarded as ethnic cleansing. The government's inability to protect the people from both its own troops and the insurgency has further eroded support for the government. Amnesty International accused security forces of exploiting the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, that enables them to hold prisoners without trial. The group argues that the law, which allows security to detain individuals for as many as 2 years without presenting charges, violating prisoners' human rights. The army sources maintain that any move to revoke AFSPA in Jammu and Kashmir would be detrimental to the security of the valley and would provide a boost to the terrorists. Former Indian Army Chief General V.K. Singh rejected the accusations that the action was not taken in the cases of human rights violations by army personnel. On October 24, 2010, he has said that 104 army personnel had been punished in Jammu and Kashmir in this regard, including 39 officers. He also said that 95% of the allegations of human rights abuses against Indian Army were proved to be false, of which he remarked, had apparently been made with the ulterior motive of maligning the armed forces. However, according to Human Rights Watch, the military courts in India, in general, were proved to be incompetent to deal with cases of serious human rights abuses and were responsible in covering up evidence and protecting the involved officers. Amnesty International, in its report in 2015, titled Denied Failures in Accountability in Jammu and Kashmir, says, with respect to investigations, an inquiry that is conducted by the same authority accused of the crime raises serious questions about the independence and impartiality of those proceedings, adding that according to the international law, an independent authority that is not involved in the alleged violations has to investigate such crimes. These human rights violations are said to have contributed to the rise of resistance in Kashmir. Psychological reasons. Psychologist Vahida Khan, explaining the rebellious nature of the Kashmiris, says that because of the tense situations in the valley from the 1990s, the generation gap between parents and young generations has increased. Young generations tend to blame their parents for failing to do anything about the political situation. So they start experimenting with their own aggressive ways to show their curbed feelings and would go against any authority. A prominent psychiatrist of the valley, Margub, described that children/teenagers are much more vulnerable to passionate actions and reactions, since the young minds are yet to completely develop psychological mechanisms. When they assume that they are pushed against the wall, they get controlled by the emotions without bothering about the consequences. Also, young people easily identify themselves with the group rather than with their individual identities. It leads to psychological distress, which causes antisocial behavior and aggressive attitude. Often, this situation gets worsened by the availability of weapons and people becoming familiar to violence after having exposed to conflict for so long. Vahida Khan remarks, The major concern is that generations of children who are experiencing long-term violence in their lives may reach adulthood perceiving that violence is a fair means of solving ethnic, religious, or political differences. Economic. High unemployment and lack of economic opportunities in Kashmir are also said to have intensified the struggle. Stone pelting. Main article: Stone pelting in Kashmir. Since the 2008 protests and 2010 unrest, the turmoil has taken a new dimension when people, particularly youngsters of the Kashmir Valley, have started pelting stones on security forces to express their aggression and protest for the loss of freedom. In turn, they get attacked by the armed personnel with pellets, rubber bullets, slingshots, and tear gas shells. This leads to eye injuries and several other kinds of injuries to many people. Security forces also face injuries and sometimes get beaten up during these events. According to Wahida Khan, most of the stone pelters are school and college-going students. Large number of these people get arrested during these events for allegedly resorting to stone pelting, after which some of them are also tortured. According to political activist Manan Bukhari, Kashmiris made stone an easily accessible and defenseless weapon, their weapon of choice for protest.